Kalorama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint, presents States of Neglect, How Red State Leaders Have Failed Their Citizens and Undermined America, by William Kleinknecht. Read by Jonathan Todd Ross. Introduction. For a nation whose governance is scattered across 50 states, what de Tocqueville called our assemblage of confederated republics, America has a strange way of acting as if the only political culture that matters is the one in its capital city. There has been a lurch to the right in Republican-controlled statehouses across the country that has had dire results for ordinary citizens, but until very recently has largely escaped the lens of the national media. Major news outlets came to this story late and with blinders on. They have tended to pay attention to manifest injustices in GOP states, such as the attack on voting rights, only to the degree that they impinge on the balance of power in Washington. They lionized Georgia's election officials in 2020 for facing down Trump's attempt at election fraud, then switched to vilifying the state's GOP for its new Jim Crow-style election law. And yet, throughout ignored the state's perennial mistreatment of its most vulnerable citizens in almost every other sector of society. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves was condemned during the COVID-19 pandemic because he defied federal guidelines relating to mask mandates, a topic du jour for the national media, not because his state had spent years slashing funds for rural hospitals, education, and infrastructure to free up money for corporate tax cuts. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is pilloried by liberals and celebrated by conservatives for the thumb he places in the eye of Joe Biden. But media on both sides otherwise ignore his far-right agenda, such as his studied refusal to collect taxes owed by major corporations in his state. What affects the lives of politicos, pundits, lobbyists, and journalists inside the Beltway has blared from the cable news shows. What has really been going on in the lives of working people in Mississippi, West Virginia, or North Carolina is rarely heard above a whisper. Only when Republican states began walking in lockstep with Trump's authoritarianism, truly imperiling our democracy for the first time since the Civil War, did most Americans in the blue states take full notice that something dangerous was happening in the rest of the country. How they could have missed it is a question that will animate future historians. The corporate money that flooded into state elections after the Supreme Court Citizens United decision in 2010 brought to power a new generation of far-right governors and legislators. Tea Party zealots, far more radical than the Reagan Republicans who preceded them. The names of governors elected in the class of 2010 are synonymous with government breakdown and attacks on workers' rights. Sam Brownback, whose Kansas experiment decimated his state's public sector and ended his political career. Rick Scott, the scandal-scarred businessman whose environmental deregulation in Florida exposed the Gulf Coast to ruinous algae blooms. Rick Snyder of Michigan, architect of a forced state takeover of Democrat-controlled cities that resulted in the Flint water crisis. New Jersey's Chris Christie, disgraced by the Bridgegate affair and the successive downgrade of the state's bond rating. And Scott Walker, who crippled collective bargaining rights in Wisconsin, a state that was once a labor stronghold. This new generation of state Republicans and their corporate allies not only cut deeply into the public services crucial to the lives of the poor and working class in regions decimated by globalization and deindustrialization, they enacted their anti-worker agenda by filling the public sphere with political propaganda that stoked fear and anger among the white working class. They have used billboards, TV, and radio ads, and social media to demonize Democrats and provoke hysteria over divisive issues such as immigration, abortion, gun rights, teachers' unions, and the socialism of the moderate who became the nation's first black president. They have left no semblance of civility in the conduct of our public affairs. The anger and cynicism that they injected into Republican state politics shook loose an avalanche of popular disaffection that came crashing down on American democracy in the Trump years, culminating in the January 6th assault on the Capitol and widespread support within the GOP for Stop the Steal and the election sabotage movement. Republicans accelerated their efforts to disenfranchise black voters at the very time that protesters were driven to the streets in revulsion over the killing of George Floyd, setting up a dangerous divide in American politics. But the stampede to the far right in Republican states has trampled on the interests of working people across a far broader range of issues than just voting rights and police reform. Since Citizens United opened the floodgates of corporate political spending, the states sprawled across the old Confederacy and the American heartland have sought to return to a Gilded Age relationship with their citizens, slashing already meager budgets, cutting taxes for the wealthy, curtailing workers' rights, scaling back regulation, and entrusting the people's welfare to the free market. As a result, their working-class citizens have become poorer, sicker, less educated, and otherwise ill-equipped to compete in the post-industrial economy when compared with their counterparts in the blue states. This long neglect of public investment has helped create a bifurcated society in which the blue states enjoy a socioeconomic status comparable to the rest of the developed world, while the red states slip into the ranks of developing nations like those in Latin America or Eastern Europe. Progressives were lulled into complacency by Joe Biden's victory in 2020 and his embrace of big government solutions to the nation's mounting inequality. The election results even set off speculation among political commentators that America was poised for a realignment as momentous as the New Deal or the Reagan Revolution. The media spent less time dwelling on an ominous portent for Democrats. The Republican Party had actually tightened its grip on state governments. How much of a realignment was it when Republicans were left with governing trifectas or control of legislatures in 28 states and attorney general offices in 26 states? To put it another way, 55% of the nation's population and 2/3 of its continuous square mileage were in states whose legislative leaders were implacably opposed to the goals of the national government and openly disdainful of democracy. Heading into the 2022 elections, with partisan gerrymandering at a fevered pace across the country and inflation depressing Biden's approval ratings, it appeared the balance would shift even more toward the Republicans' favor. The left tends to be reassured when progressive regimes are in control of the federal government, with its awesome powers to intervene in the social welfare of Americans. But in previous eras of federal activism, most notably in the Roosevelt and Johnson administrations, Washington was not contending with unified and even militant opposition to its goals in more than half the states. It is easy to forget how much of the country's governmental apparatus is controlled by the states, and how much federal policy depends on state cooperation. The actions of state leaders can make the difference between an enlightened society and a political backwater. State and local governments are not only responsible for the nation's entire system of elections, they also control the police and most civil and criminal courts, virtually all of public education, and the lion's share of public health. They collect billions in taxes, handle most health and safety regulations, and control a huge share of the federal money that flows to their states for everything, from flood control and highway construction to high-speed rail and unemployment insurance. All that federal funding has little meaning if states refuse to accept it, as grandstanding Republican governors and legislatures have begun to do with some regularity. In 2010, New Jersey Governor Christie turned away $3 billion in federal funding for a commuter rail tunnel under the Hudson River, a move that the state's senior U.S. Senator Frank Lautenberg called one of the biggest policy blunders in New Jersey history. But he was hardly the first Republican governor to cheat his or her citizens in the name of short-term political gain or service to corporate contributors. Former Texas Governor Rick Perry and other Republicans rejected billions in unemployment benefits contained in the Obama administration's stimulus package in 2009. 3 other Republican governors, Rick Scott of Florida, Scott Walker of Wisconsin, and John Kasich of Ohio, turned down federal money for high-speed rail projects in their states in 2011, despite their obvious economic and environmental benefits. A more recent example was the decision by 25 Republican governors in the spring of 2021 to order an early termination of unemployment benefits for more than 4 million of their citizens, claiming the money, part of the Biden administration's response to the pandemic, was keeping people from going back to work. In fact, numerous studies found that states that stopped the benefits early saw no greater job growth than those that continued the checks until the expiration of the federal program in September 2021. Meanwhile, the Congressional Joint Economic Committee found in June 2021 that the early cutoff would cost red state economies more than $12 billion. As of this writing, 12 states have frustrated one of the key elements of Obamacare by refusing to expand Medicaid, even though that decision has cost thousands of lives and meant rejecting billions in federal funds. Turning away money is not the only way red states have successfully thwarted the federal government. They also have done so by defying the mandates of federal agencies and simply not participating in enforcement. Missouri Governor Mike Parson signed a law in June 2021 that barred state and local authorities from cooperating with any federal investigation that impinges on Second Amendment rights, which, according to a legal brief by the Justice Department, essentially nullified federal firearms laws in the state and impeded joint federal-state cases against gun and drug traffickers. Missouri's was the most extreme of 9 laws adopted in Republican states that had in some form prohibited local cooperation in federal gun cases. They were part of a trend toward a relaxation of state gun laws aimed at countering Biden's plan to strengthen such laws at the federal level. Montana Governor Greg Gianforte even signed legislation to allow citizens to carry guns into the state capitol and on university campuses. The Environmental Protection Agency is another agency whose mission can be undermined by state resistance. The EPA was designed to set national policy, establish legal mandates for pollution control, and disperse funding, but it relies on the states for most enforcement and has no easy remedy if state officials, such as those in Texas, refuse to do the job. In the Obama years, Texas Governor Perry defied EPA permitting requirements for polluting industries and called on the president to rein in this rogue agency. His successor, Greg Abbott, likewise announced during an appearance in the West Texas oil fields in January 2021 that his administration was launching a broad legal assault on President Biden's clean air initiatives. Abbott said he wanted to make clear that Texas is going to protect the oil and gas industry from any type of hostile attack from Washington, D.C. This was the same public official who, while serving as his state's attorney general, had sued the Obama administration 44 times, once summing up his job this way: "I go into the office in the morning, I sue Barack Obama, and then I go home. Indeed, Republican state attorneys general have used lawsuits to delay or defeat federal initiatives on a wide range of issues, including the Affordable Care Act, immigration reform, criminal justice oversight, same-sex marriage, abortion, and gun control. It's the reality under our system of federalism. Washington set aside money for your unemployment benefits, but can't prevent your Republican governor from turning away the funds. It can enact criminal justice reform, but can't stop state authorities from kicking in your door. The defiance of our national government became truly dangerous in the post-Trump era, as Republican state leaders took aim at democracy itself. In the last months of 2021, there was a storm of activity in virtually all the Republican states that appeared designed to counter any Democratic victories by engineering the kind of electoral coup that Trump failed to carry out in the 2020 elections. It is ironic that in drafting the Constitution, the founders worried about overweening power in the states for the threat it might pose to owners of property and businesses. More than a few members of the Continental Congress feared that the state legislatures, if they came under the sway of the unwashed masses, would take actions to jeopardize the interests of the wealthy. The mutability of the laws of the states is found to be a serious evil, Madison wrote to Jefferson in October 1787. The injustice of them has been so frequent and so flagrant as to alarm the most steadfast friends of republicanism. A reform, therefore, which does not make provision for private rights must be materially defective. But the electoral despotism at the state level that concerned the founders has not come in the form of a threat against the propertied interests, but rather as an attempted coup by the propertied interests. For years, the Republican assault on democracy was limited to voter suppression and gerrymandering, corrosive enough in themselves, but blossomed after the 2020 election into an attack on the election machinery at the very heart of our system of government. Trump's false claim that there was widespread voting fraud in the election hit home with the rank and file of his party, despite the failure of his campaign to present compelling evidence in dozens of unsuccessful state and federal lawsuits that any such thing had happened. An ABC News Ipsos poll found in January 2022 that more than 70% of Republicans believed the election was stolen. Between January 1st and December 7th, 2021, 19 Republican-led states had passed 34 laws that made it harder to vote, either by curtailing mail-in or early voting, imposing harsher voter ID laws, or enabling purges of voting rolls. More worrisome, Republican lawmakers filed 10 bills in 7 states that would have directly empowered partisan officials to overturn election results. None of those bills passed, but the mere fact that they were proposed and taken seriously, and were expected to be reintroduced in 2022, was enough to keep defenders of democracy awake at night. As the nonprofit Brennan Center for Justice put it, while none of these bills have become law, they expose the anti-democratic motivation behind the larger election sabotage movement, and provide a worrying marker of how far voting rights opponents want to go. Their widespread introduction is an urgent warning sign for the health of our democracy. The enemies of free and fair elections have moved against democratic institutions on a dizzying number of fronts. Republican legislatures in 3 battleground states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Texas, have followed Arizona in launching groundless audits of their 2020 election results, without any chance that they could convince federal courts to overturn the election. Michael Gableman, a former state Supreme Court justice overseeing the Republican audit in Wisconsin, even threatened to jail the mayors of Madison and Green Bay if they refused to sit for depositions. In what the Associated Press termed a slow-motion insurrection, Republican states across the country were seeking to remove oversight of elections from nonpartisan agencies and put it in the hands of state legislators. The most publicized example being in Georgia, where Governor Brian Kemp signed a bill that removed Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger as chair of the State Elections Board and gave authority to the legislature to hire and fire members of county elections boards. Armed with this new power, legislators have deputized local GOP officials to purge the boards of black Democrats. In state after state, including the battleground of Michigan, Republicans were replacing county elections boards members with Stop the Steal zealots, an effort made easier by the resignations of election officials harried by Trump supporters. As of December 2021, Michigan's GOP had replaced members of the county boards in 8 of the state's 11 most populous counties. How successful these efforts in Republican states would be in overturning election results in 2022 or 2024 remained to be seen, but they appeared certain to reduce vote counting to chaos and further undermine Americans' faith in democracy. Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan watchdog group made up of former government officials, corporate executives, and academicians, predicted that the new state laws would make elections more difficult to administer and even unworkable, make it more difficult to finalize election results, allow for election interference and manipulation by hyperpartisan actors, and, in the worst cases, allow state legislatures to overturn the will of the voters and precipitate a democracy crisis. Much of the ferment in state election law boils down quite simply to an effort to keep racial and ethnic minorities from voting, an issue that was thought to have been settled decades ago, but which the far right has resurrected in the last decade. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had thwarted Jim Crow-era suppression tactics in the South, which Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had described as an insidious and pervasive evil which had been perpetuated in certain parts of our country through unremitting and ingenious defiance of the Constitution. But in 2013, a narrow conservative majority of the Supreme Court, in Shelby County v. Holder, threw out the Act's requirement that states with a history of voter suppression obtain pre-clearance from the federal government before making changes to their voting laws. Violations of the Act were still illegal, but states wouldn't have the federal government breathing down their necks. The ruling opened a new era of voter suppression not only in the South, but in other Republican-controlled states around the country. Within 2 hours of the court's decision, Greg Abbott, then Texas Attorney General, tweeted that the state would immediately reinstate a strict voter ID law that had previously been thrown out as a violation of the Voting Rights Act. The next day, the North Carolina General Assembly set the wheels in motion to do the same thing, ultimately adopting restrictions so severe that a federal appellate court found they had targeted black voters with almost surgical precision. Across the country, polling places in minority districts were moved or shuttered entirely. Within 5 years, 23 states had implemented newly restrictive voter ID laws, all of them Republican-controlled. The insidious and pervasive evil was back in business. In addition to Texas and North Carolina, Arizona, Kansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Indiana, Virginia, and Wisconsin issued particularly strict voter ID laws. But no state moved with greater alacrity to reverse gains in minority voting than Georgia. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, a bipartisan federal agency, found in a 2018 report that Georgia was the only state that had deficiencies in every category of voter suppression in the Commission's purview: restrictive voter ID laws, proof of citizenship requirement, purges of registration rolls, curtailment of early voting, and closed or relocated polling places. The 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election, in which Kemp faced Stacey Abrams, a Democratic state representative, was an ugly showcase for the tactics of voter suppression. The fix was in from the beginning, since Kemp, then Georgia Secretary of State, was overseeing the election in which he was a contender, as clear a conflict of interest as there ever was. Abrams' campaign was aggressive in its efforts to register black voters, and polls ahead of the election showed the race was competitive. So Kemp did everything he could to keep blacks from voting. The Associated Press reported less than a month before the election that his office had frozen 53,000 voter registrations, predominantly those of African Americans, because their registration form was not an exact match to records the state had on file. The way the rules were written, a registration could be thrown out for as little as a missing hyphen in the last name, or because the state had entered the information incorrectly. Kemp also pursued a controversial policy of purging the rolls of citizens who had not been active in recent voting. His office had paired 1.4 million voters from the rolls in the previous 6 years, including 670,000 in 2017 alone. Kemp, who Abrams called a remarkable architect of voter suppression, won the election by about 55,000 votes. The pattern continued in the 2020 election, when so many polling places were closed in black neighborhoods that voters in Atlanta had to wait hours to cast their ballots. One would think that the national adulation showered upon Georgia's Republican officials for facing down Donald Trump might have made the state GOP warm up to the idea of holding honest elections in the future. That was decidedly not the case. Instead, Kemp in March 2021 put his pen to the first major election law to emerge from the Stop the Steal movement, which ironically had made him one of its villains. Besides giving the GOP-dominated state legislature control of the state election board, the new law reduced the amount of time voters have to request an absentee ballot, set new ID requirements for absentee ballots, barred officials from mailing out absentee ballot applications to all voters, banned mobile voting centers, and reduced the number of ballot drop boxes by nearly 75%, and required they be placed inside government buildings. Kemp and his allies had wanted to get rid of voting by mail almost entirely, but local business leaders who met with them for days over the drafting of the bill, including representatives from Delta Airlines, prevailed upon them to keep it. The law was enacted to solve a problem that didn't exist, since there were no significant issues of fraud in the election. In reality, the measure was aimed at the same citizens of color that Georgia had sought to disenfranchise since Reconstruction. Kemp signed the law surrounded by 6 white males in front of a painting of a slave plantation, while a black female state lawmaker, Representative Park Cannon, who had knocked on his office door seeking to witness the ceremony, was forcibly removed by state troopers and arrested. The symbolism could not have been more powerful. As Anna Dennis, executive director of Common Cause Georgia, told Mother Jones, "This bill is Jim Crow with a suit and tie." The Justice Department filed a lawsuit seeking to overturn the Georgia election law, but the inferno, the battle for American democracy, was already raging out of control. It was so out of control that the corporate leaders who had spent years bankrolling the very politicians pushing the election sabotage movement were alarmed at how far toward sedition they were willing to go. Even Charles Koch, the oil billionaire who had been at the forefront of injecting dark money into state politics, was startled by the divisiveness he did so much to create. "Boy, did we screw up," he wrote in a memoir. "What a mess." After Georgia passed its election law, leaders of major corporations in the state, including Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola, spoke out in opposition, and hundreds across the country joined in a statement condemning the passage of legislation anywhere that made it harder for people to vote.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?